Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. You can do 9 out of 10 things right on a portrait, but if you do this one thing wrong, you can ruin the whole thing. What's that one thing? Using the wrong focal length. Let me explain. Okay, this is going to be an issue that's really common for photographers who like to use zoom lenses. Zoom lenses are great, but if you're not paying attention, it can really mess up your shot. What often happens is photographers reframe their shot with the zoom, right? They're too close or too far and they reframe. The problem is you're changing your focal length, meaning you're also changing your depth of field. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to do a quick and simple one light portrait session, and I'm going to demonstrate what happens when you use the zoom instead of reframing, or when you don't take into account using the right focal length for your portrait. Okay, you've seen this setup in other videos I've done. It's a simple one light setup using my AD200 Pro. Sky's giving me a hand doing this session. This is how we set it up from beginning to end. Okay, we're all set up. You've got your exposure and your depth of field the way you want it. Great. And then all of a sudden, you yank that zoom ring. You no longer have the same portrait. It is a completely different portrait now. Zooms are great, they really are. But when you use them to reframe your shot, you may be getting more than what you bargained for. But if you're trying to get shots to match, in terms of depth of field, it won't happen that way. They won't match. They will look fundamentally different. Let's have a look at a couple of shots from what we just shot in this session to compare the differences in focal length and depth of field and perspective. Okay, so we have two images here. This one was shot at, well, 98 millimeters, thanks to a zoom. Let's call it 100. And this image was shot at 24 millimeters. So this is a typical situation. You shoot a close-up with the zoom at 100 and you back it out to 24 to shoot the full length, right? Typical. That happens very often. However, here's where the problems creep in. See this plant back here? I'm going to show a cropped in version of this same image. This plant is fairly sharp. Both of these images were shot at f8. So when I look at the image at 100 millimeters at f8, we've got a little softening of the plant that doesn't compete too much with sky. I haven't done anything to these images. I will probably put a vignette to soften it up even more, but when you look at this one, the plant and sky are in competition because of the level of sharpness. There just isn't enough separation. So this is what you have to keep in mind when you crank the zoom back to reframe. You're not just reframing, you're changing the depth of field, you're changing the perspective, you're changing the portrait. So what can you do? Well, you have two options. First, if the reframing you need isn't too large, you can always use foot zoom. Just move the camera. And yes, that will change the depth of field slightly, but often not that much. If you need to do something like going from an extreme close-up to a full-length shot, you may actually have to change the f-stop to get the same depth of field in the full length shot as you had in the close-up. Again, the idea here is that if you're trying to match between shots, the depth of field is going to throw people off subconsciously. Sometimes it doesn't matter. If they're two completely different images, like you're doing a full-length portrait for the wall where you want a lot of depth of field, well then opening it up and changing the focal length won't matter. But if you're also going to have a close-up hanging next to that full length, and the close-up has a nice soft background and the full length doesn't, it's sort of weird, and it won't seem weird digitally on a camera or in a phone, but when you print them, it will seem very strange. Okay, so this takes some planning, right? So if you were already shooting wide open on your lens, you can't change the f-stop. You got to plan ahead. You've got to have an f-stop for the close-up and an f-stop for the wide angle that works with your zoom. Otherwise, you're cooked. Now, the other thing to consider, and I'll show a couple of examples here, is perspective change when you have extremes of close-up versus wide angle. The wide angle is not really very flattering. It's just not a good look for portraits. I'm shooting very wide angle right now, but that's just how you have to do it to get close to the camera. When you're going to print something for the wall like this, you really don't want that wide angle. It's not flattering to the face at all. All of this was really drilled into me in the film business because if you have different depths of field between cuts, it's jarring. And it's like all of a sudden the background's in focus, the background's out of focus, and you're like getting whipped around like that. It's just not tolerated in the film business. I see all over the internet with portrait photographers getting away with murder with it, and that's fine. As long as the images don't hang next to each other, as long as they're for a different purpose, whatever, it's great. But if you have to think about images displaying together, you have to pay attention to focal length and depth of field, or it can ruin your session. If you want to learn more about some of the exposure tutorials I've done, take a look at the links I've got here. Otherwise, thanks for watching this video. Hope to see you in the next video. Until then, cheers.